Yes, wonderful. I hope that still records when you share, but we will see. Okay, wonderful. So everybody, welcome to Qualitative Methods of Business Research. Today we have what we call a research talk. So it gives you a little bit more insight into how research is actually done, how researchers of my team and my network actually carry out qualitative research. So whenever something is unclear to you, please ask. Of course, we have spread these 4 research talks over the whole of the semester. I assume that most of you are in the early phases of this course. So you may or may not completely get the beauty of, say, grounded theory until you have read a little bit into the course. But as you can do the course at your own speed, we can't synchronize in this sense very efficiently. So, but what we want to do before, well, the structure here, I want to know how you're doing. Then we have a presentation or a talk with Thomas, and then of course we have discussion and questions for you. So the first question is, how are you doing? How are you doing? And some of you have probably already had the experience how to comment or annotate in this in Zoom, and you can do now. You can put your stamp where in this plane you are. On the horizontal axis, the installment that you're working on currently now, and how confident you are. So we see already some people coming in here. Wonderful. All right. Good. So what we're seeing is that a large fraction, maybe with some outliers, have progressed until installment number 2. Some outliers are there for installment number 4. However, we see a pretty large spread across the level of, confidence that you have in mastering these installments. It is naturally the case that people who have not started yet tend to be on the lower end of the I feel confident scale. I mean, this doesn't bother me. However, on the installment number 2 scale, we have people ranging from feeling slightly confident to this is all Greek to me. I have no clue what is going on. So we're not recording at this moment, are we? No, we're not. We haven't recorded. Have I recorded? Yeah, we're recording. Oh,
yes.
We're recording. But I can pause the recording for opening the discussion, which I do now. So you can open your microphone and ask questions, just in case you are in the "this is all Greek to me" group, and you want something for clarification, etc. Feel free to ask. Open your microphone. I don't see. Of course, you could also use the chat. resume the recording, and we continue. Of course, you always have the opportunity to ask questions through the forum, or you will see this slide in the next research talk again, maybe with a different horizontal scale, but you will see this again, and we can start a communication, start a discussion about this if there's still a fraction of students, you know, feeling Greek, feeling left behind, etc. Okay. So wonderful. So what I do now is, as always, I have to trash everything that you contributed here. Otherwise, we would not be able to see what is going on. So we're having the presentation by Thomas coming up, and for the ones who have been with us with the kickoff, who they know who Thomas is. You haven't seen him, which you do now, but you have read or has seen a slide about him, which you do again here. Okay, wonderful. So, Thomas, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So hello, welcome from my side as well. My name is Thomas Leicht. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Chair for Innovation Management. Approaching the end of my third year already, Bernd, time flies.
I know.
And yeah, as I said, I'm a doctoral candidate here. In my research, this is actually not quite up to date. In my research, I focus mostly on the scaling process of startup firms. And besides being a doctoral candidate, I'm also a member of the Innovation Greenhouse here. For those of you who don't know it yet, the Inno Greenhouse is this glass building next to the Denkbar. And it's our entrepreneurship and innovation hub at the university. For those of you who are interested in that, I can very much recommend to you to maybe Google the word. I will type it down in the chat real quick. Startup.
It's there. I put it in the chat.
Yeah, sure. That's also a possibility, yeah. And because a colleague of mine, Max is his name, he's currently doing this Startup Garage program, and I can very much recommend to you, to every one of you who is interested in maybe starting a company or is maybe just curious about how you would do that, to visit this program. He's doing this really, really great. So having said all that, I would say that I directly jump into my presentation, right, Bernd?
Yeah, so I stop sharing, and you can share your screen.
Let's do that. So now you should see the presentation, right? Not the presentation mode. Is that correct?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. So maybe one short disclaimer before I start with the presentation. Bernd has already briefly talked about it. When I was preparing my slides, I noticed that since you are not that far into the course already, some of the stuff that I will be talking about may sound kind of cryptic to you. But I would say that's perfectly fine. Just try to follow along. And also, if you have any questions, you can always ask me. And maybe a good approach is that once you progress a bit further along the course, try to go back to my slides from time to time. And then you will maybe be able to make more sense of some of the stuff that I'm talking about, and also understand why you are actually learning the things that you are learning in the course. For instance, like something about words like positivistic or constructionist, etc. And we think this will be helpful for your learning progress.
Thomas, may I come in here with a question from the chat, whether you will make the presentation available? I don't see anything that prevents this.
Yes, of course. I will make the slides available.
Wonderful.
Okay, so second, okay, I have to click here, I guess. So first things first, let's start with the learning goals. So what is the idea of this presentation today? I want you to first develop a basic understanding of what grounded theory is. as I'm going to talk about grounded theory. Develop a basic understanding of what the Joya template for grounded theory is. More on that in a second. Know how to prepare for applying grounded theory in your master thesis. And then also understand why grounded theory may be particularly interesting for you when you write a master thesis. So the agenda today will be first quick intro into grounded theory, then some more stuff about the basic components of grounded theory. Then I will talk about the Joya template, and last but not least, about how to apply grounded theory using the Joya template. And then, of course, we'll also have some time for questions. So let's start with the first point, introduction to grounded theory. Sometimes when you want to define something, it is helpful to first start with what it is actually not. And I think that is very much true for grounded theory, because the term grounded theory is also kind of confusing. So what is grounded theory not? Grounded theory is not a theory. The name grounded theory stands for a methodology to conduct qualitative research. And the reason it is called grounded theory is that the result of this methodology, this way of doing qualitative research, is a grounded theory. Okay, so it's not a theory, it's a methodology. Second point, doing grounded theory is not positivistic quantitative research. So what most people think about when they think about research is what I would argue is quantitative research, where you usually start with some kind of theory, then derive a research question based on that theory, some hypotheses to test that research question, collect data, analyze the data, usually using multivariate data analysis, test the hypothesis, and then based on the results that you get, try to answer your research question. This is not what grounded theory is. Grounded theory is a way to do qualitative research. Grounded theory is also not the same as qualitative research. So in the early days of grounded theory, some of the authors that introduced this approach claimed that, well, essentially grounded theory is how all qualitative research should be conducted. I think today most authors would no longer say that, but rather view it as a way to do qualitative research, one of many different possible ways. And then last but not least, grounded theory is also not a well-defined set of fixed steps and procedures, as there are many different versions of how you can do grounded theory. And I don't want to talk too much about the different versions and the history of all that. Just the key takeaway that you should learn from this slide here is that today there are many different versions of how you can do grounded theory. There's very well known the Corbin-Strauss approach, Walton-Walsh, Chalmers, but also a lot of other approaches. And there's not just one way to do it. So what is grounded theory? For this course, we define grounded theory as a holistic methodology for doing qualitative research in order to generate new theory, i.e. a theoretical model that is grounded in data. So this is the definition, and let me guide you step by step through what that means. I'm seeing there's something in the chat again. Bernd, do you know the ID and the passcode for the Zoom link? Are you still here? Okay, I don't think he is. But you can always just...
Of course I am here.
Okay.
Oh, and of course I have the Zoom link. So the link is here. If this helps, and the passcode I posted into the chat as well would be that, and the numeric passcode, just in case you come in with a telephone, would be that. So
and what you can also do is always log into Elias. The link should be at the bottom page of the Elias page. The course.
Or you pick it from the the study guide, but we don't want to be smart asses here. If somebody has a problem, it's no problem to post the links. So no worries.
That's true.
Okay, I'm sorry, Thomas. So you continue. Thank you.
Sure. So let's go through this step by step. first of all, I said that grounded theory is a methodology for conducting qualitative research. And what I would like you to do here is to once again use the annotation function and maybe tell me what qualitative research actually is. So what have you learned so far? What is qualitative research? What is a qualitative researcher doing? And you can also use the chat if you prefer that. So if you had to explain to someone, what is qualitative research? What is that? Come on, guys, you're sitting in a course for qualitative research.
Have you allowed students to annotate?
Should be allowed, yes.
Because my annotation...
no, it wasn't allowed. So it's my bad. Now it is.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
So once again, okay, so someone in the chat writes, it's not based on numbers. Yeah, very good. What else comes to mind when you think about qualitative research?
You use variables that are not quantifiable. Maybe something like that.
Yeah, okay. So someone else writes words and theories, use interviews. Yeah, very well. Very good. Non-metric, yes. Yeah, that's true as well. Contextual understanding, yeah, observation, investigate, interpret. Focus groups, yeah, that's also qualitative research. We'll learn a bit more about that in one of the later installments. Okay, so very good. Surveys, researcher is close, yes. Closer to the people that are observed, yes. Very good. So someone in the chat writes, gathering non-numerical data such as words, images, or observations to gain insights into complex and often context-dependent phenomena. Yeah, very good. It sounds also almost like you Googled it. Describe it. Yeah, so I mean, we can wrap it up here, I would say. All the stuff, pretty much all the stuff that you were talking about here is correct. And then now I have to delete the annotations real quick. Clear drawings. And I guess another way to say it, I brought a quick definition here with me, is qualitative research involves collecting and analyzing non-numerical data to understand concepts, opinions, or experiences. It can be used to gather in-depth insights into a problem or generate new ideas for research. So it's pretty much what you just said. And grounded theory is one way to do that. So when we say grounded theory as methodology for conducting qualitative research, grounded theory is a way to do all that. I have to finish the annotations real quick. Okay, that worked. So getting to the next point, something is not working here for some reason. I'll click it here. So next point is grounded theory aims to develop new theory. Now the question is, what do I mean by theory, or what do grounded theorists mean by theory? So theory is, in grounded theory, not just the description of events, actions, or something else. Theory is something that fully develops all relevant categories with properties and dimensions, links categories, and thus provides an integrated model of categories that explain a phenomenon. And the last bullet point here is what's really important. So theory essentially comes up to an integrated model of categories, of concepts that you have identified that explain something. So a good example for that would be that, let's say you are an amusement park company and you want to evaluate and understand the buying decisions of your customers. So what theory would mean in this context is that you would want to come up with a model that explains the purchasing behavior of your customers. So this theoretic model would include concepts, categories such as macroeconomic factors, maybe seasonal factors such as the weather, is it hot, is it cold, etc., and depict all these categories in some kind of model, maybe with boxes and arrows, that then explains the purchasing behavior of your customers. So this is what theory is in grounded theory. And another way to make it a bit more clear to what theory is in grounded theory is to also think about the purposes of theory. So for grounded theorists, theory is not something that is separate from, let's say, what practitioners are doing, but rather very closely related to it. And this is a very important point. So good theory, the first point is predicts and explains behavior of people, organizations. It is usable in practical applications. So for instance, by the amusement park company to better explain and predict behavior, purchasing behavior. It is also useful for theoretical advance in research and also future research. So for instance, when you come up with a new theoretic model, you may also come up with some new categories that seem to influence the purchasing behavior. And on that basis, you may come up with some new quantitative studies where you actually want to test to what degree those categories influence the purchasing behavior. So this is the second point. Grounded theory aims to develop new theory. Third point is that the theory should be grounded in data. So in grounded theory, we use a very, very broad understanding of what data is. There's this very common notion of everything is data. You can use images, you can use videos, you can use YouTube comments, you can use podcast transcripts, etc., etc., etc. Everything is data. It often combines multiple types of data. So very, very commonly, you have primary data in the forms of interviews. So data that is collected particularly for your research, and also some kind of secondary data, maybe something that is already present on the web that was not collected just for not generated just for the purpose of your research, but still useful to investigate your research question. And yeah, you will learn a bit more about that in the later installments. Yeah. Now, so this is data. What does grounded in data mean? Grounded in data means that the categories, the subcategories, and the linkages between them, so essentially your theoretic model, the boxes and arrows of your model, are developed through information that actually derives from data. And the big difference here is what grounded theorists call armchair theorizing. So especially in the early days of, let's say, economics, but pretty much all social science, you had these very smart people that essentially sit back in their armchair, and thought about stuff, and then came up with theoretic models. So this is what armchair theorizing is. And grounded theorists claim that actually this is not a good way to come up with theory. This is not a good way to come up with theoretic models, because the result of these theoretic models is often that they are kind of distant from reality. And a better way, therefore, to come up with theory would be to first look at reality, to generate data from reality, and then based on that data, come up with a theoretic model, and only include stuff in the theoretic model that is actually in the data. So avoid armchair theorizing, and instead ground your theoretic model in data. So this is the third part. And the fourth and last is that it is a holistic methodology. So grounded theory defines different kinds of methodological moves for the entire research process. So this is true for, let's say, how you sample data, how you collect the data, how you analyze the data, and even how you write everything up. And these methodological moves of all the different steps that, in the research process, they are integrated. So they are based on each other and make sure that and this integration makes sure that the entire research process is set up in a way that ultimately leads to a theoretic model that is grounded in data. Okay, so what results from that is that you actually have to apply these different methodological moves holistically. So this is something that also a lot of researchers are still doing wrong, and they are usually heavily criticized when they turn in a paper to some journal, to submit a paper to some journal doing that. A lot of researchers just use different components of grounded theory and then call it grounded theory. But you have to use every component, or if you don't use one, have a very good reason why you don't do it, because they are integrated in a way to make sure that your theoretic models at the end of the day actually grounded in data. Now, what are these components? Essentially, I think across, if you take a broad look across all the different grounded theory approaches that are out there, you can distinguish, let's say, 5 major components of what grounded theory is, no matter what the approach is. And that is usually open-mindedness, second, theoretical sampling, third, theoretical saturation, fourth, constant comparison, and then last but not least, simultaneous analysis and sampling. Now, what are these components exactly? This is the next point on our agenda. I will start with open-mindedness. So in the very early claim was that researchers should not just be open-minded, but actually start with blank mind. So essentially, you should have no prior knowledge about the literature, about anything that is related to your research before you start doing research, in order to not be biased in some way, shape, or form. Now, obviously, that is not very realistic, especially if you are an already advanced researcher. And quite frankly, it's also not reasonable to do that, because if you really have no knowledge at all, chances are that you will end up doing something that has already been done before. So instead, people, I would say, use today rather the term open-mindedness instead of blank mind. And the idea here is that you make sure that you are open-minded about the topic of research you're interested in, by reading, well, first of all, by reading literature without assuming absolute knowledge of the authors. So this is also something that I think a lot of social scientists tend to do. They have these big theories that were introduced by these very smart people, very popular people, and they just think, well, this has to be right. So the idea here is to maybe reread them and think critically about them. Maybe this may not be right. Okay, so this is the first thing. The second thing is to use literature to develop a first understanding of the field. So the idea is not necessarily that you already know everything there is to know about your field of research, but rather to just get an overview and to understand, maybe to develop an understanding of the things that you don't know yet. So knowing what you don't know. Another tip here is to read a broad range of papers, even if they may only be loosely connected to what you're actually doing, just to get some inspiration about some other research avenues that you might go down to. Another idea here is to just avoid thinking in hypotheses. This is also something that a lot of researchers are doing. When they read stuff, they immediately think, okay, this may be a hypothesis that needs testing. But the idea of grounded theory, and I would argue qualitative research in general quite often, is to actually generate new hypotheses. It's not necessarily to already think about hypotheses and then, testing them. And last but not least, and this is, I think, the most important one, to only formulate a broad research question. So in grounded theory, it is very common to just have a very broad research question that kind of defines the direction you want to go to, and then define the research question a bit more clearly later down the line. And sometimes, and this is even in very, very good research, not uncommon, your research question may change completely just because you came up with some completely new stuff in some interview that may be interesting. So this is open-mindedness, and the general goal here is to make sure, well, to increase the likelihood, at least, to develop new theoretic insights that may not have been confirmed by previous knowledge yet. So this is the first component. Second component of grounded theory is theoretical sampling. So when you think about sampling, I think the most people will have something in mind that is in some way in some way, shape, or form resembles random sampling, which is very common in quantitative studies. So usually in quantitative studies, you try to collect some cases that are representative of a given population, and you try to collect enough cases to allow you to actually use multivariate data analysis methods. This is not how sampling looks like in grounded theory. More about research in general, which is, I think, the stuff that you learn in the assignments is pretty similar to what I will talk about here. And that is theoretical sampling. So theoretical sampling is not the random collection of cases, but a purposive selection of cases that enable you to further develop the theoretical model. So the general idea is to choose the next set of informants or documents, interview partners, or let's say some secondary data, for instance, podcast transcripts, YouTube comments, etc., based on questions that arise during the analysis. So it's not like you're not doing random sampling, but you actively think about, okay, these are still some open questions for me that I wonder about. What data could help me to answer these questions? And then you specifically choose these cases, documents, data, try to collect data that will likely help you to answer these questions. So getting back to our example of the amusement park, you may have, let's say you already have conducted a couple of interviews and learned something about the purchasing behavior of your customers. And then you realize, well, wait a second, almost all the customers that I've talked to are in the age range of, let's say, between 30 and 40. And then I have this one customer that was already 60 and he said something completely different. And then you may wonder, hey, wait a minute, maybe age kind of interferes with my current knowledge of the purchasing behavior. Maybe age also plays a role. Maybe older people or younger people behave differently when they purchase a ticket to an amusement park. So what you could do then next to find out more about that is to specifically sample customers that are older or maybe younger, to then find out more about the purchasing behavior of these customers as well. So this is theoretical sampling, the second component of grounded theory. Third one is theoretical saturation as a stop criterion. So how long should you continue theoretical sampling? Ground theorists say you should continue until you have something that they call theoretical saturation, meaning that the theoretical model that you try to develop is well, fully developed in terms of its categories, properties, etc. Now, how do you know when you reach this point? How do you know, well, now I know everything, now I know all the factors, for instance, that influence the purchasing behavior of my customers. I know everything about the personal factors on the micro level. I know everything about the macro factors, like the general economic situation, weather, etc., etc. And I also know everything about the linkages between those and how they interact. So the idea here is that you probably won't know that you are actually at that point, but you want to be reasonably confident that you are. And this is, at the end of the day, a judgment call that you have to make. And a good indicator for that is also that even though you conduct maybe additional interviews, you generate only very, very little additional knowledge that is linked to your theoretical model. And once you reach that point, you may go on further a bit, maybe sample a bit more interviews. And if that doesn't really change, this is a good sign that maybe you've reached something like theoretical here, and you can stop conducting additional interviews. But at the end of the day, this is really a judgment call. And it also depends a bit on what your goal of your model is. How far should it go? But I will talk a bit more about that in a second. So yeah, the ultimate result of that is that you probably have varying sample depth for different categories that are part of your theoretical model. Maybe you need a couple of interviews to find more about how the weather impacts the purchasing behavior, but then a lot more about how the personal, let's say, job situation, what the salary is, etc., is impacts the purchasing behavior. It can depend a bit on the category that you're looking at. Yeah, and so this was the third one, theoretical situation. Theoretical situation is the stopping criterion. The fourth one is constant comparison, and then we're almost done. Constant comparison in grounded theory refers to the fact that you constantly want to compare different bits of data that you collect. So let's say you start with a first interview, then you conduct a second one, and what you do when you analyze the second one is that you constantly go back to the first one, look at what was said in the first one. Okay, here in the second one, the person is once again talking about how the weather impacts the purchasing behavior. What was the first one saying? And you go back and forth. And what you're essentially doing here with constant comparison that way is that you break data down into manageable pieces and then compare these manageable pieces of data. And you can do these comparisons across different levels. So you can do what I just said. You can can do comparisons by comparing different cases, different interviews of different people. You can compare different groups of cases. Let's say you have a group of people that are in the age range of 30 to 40, and then a group of people that are in the age range of 40 to 50, and then you compare them group-wise. You can compare different categories, so concepts that you came up with in the interviews, and so on and so on. And the idea of this constant comparison is that you, well, end up with a fully developed theoretical model and avoid implicit assumptions. So by comparing all the stuff that you come up with constantly, you make sure that it at least increases the likelihood that you think of more or less everything that may in some way, shape, or form be related to your theoretical model. And yeah, I've already made some examples here. I will repeat it once again, maybe go a bit further down on it. So some comparisons that you could make here are that you compare different buying decisions of one customer, you compare buying decisions of different customers within one group, buying decisions of different customer groups, effect of different events such as COVID versus war, etc. So this is the fourth component of grounded theory, constant comparison. The fifth one is simultaneous analysis and sampling. And this is also a very important one with grounded theory. So in grounded theory, you sample new data and analyze data simultaneously. So usually what you say is you start with, let's say, conducting the first interview, immediately start to analyze it, come up with some questions in that interview, and then based on the questions, conduct the next interview. And this may mean that you sample a different person or a specific type of person. This may mean that you maybe ask even other questions to learn out more about something. Ultimately, this leads to what you may call a continuous and iterative process that looks like this. So you collect some data, you analyze the data, you have some new questions, and based on these questions, collect some more data, analyze the data, and so on and so on. And regarding the timeline of your research project, this will mean that, well, you start with sampling and then almost immediately start with data analysis. Do this simultaneously, continue with it while you're still writing your paper, and then eventually you only write your paper. And once again, this whole process only starts once your theoretical model is saturated.
So Thomas,
okay, so that much.
May I come in here with, can you go back to the last slide so that we have this five different components? What you're essentially saying is that it is so different from quantitative research that it's worthwhile looking at these 5 different components and compare them what they would be in a quantitative setting. So open-mindedness is not something for the quantitatively minded. Open-mindedness would compare to something like you have a theory and you develop hypotheses in a quantitative setting. Theoretical sampling, as you said, we try to have random sampling in some shape or form in quantitative rather than the theoretical sampling. Theoretical saturation to arrive at something that is meaningful, you would argue in a quantitative setting that the larger the n, the larger the number of observation is, the better it is. So look at your measures, at the validity of your measures, etc. That would be around this. Constant comparison is nothing for the quantitatively minded, for the research that you do in econometrics, say. So maybe you have some methodologies like the difference in difference where you have some comparison before and after, etc., but you're not constantly comparing. So what you do, comparing data points. So what you're doing is you're analyzing them in one go. You run one regression on all of the data points that you have, and you're not comparing the data points with one another as a part of the analysis. Plus, what I think is very important is the simultaneous analysis and sampling may come odd or may feel odd to econometricians. So we have a strong, very, very strong, rooted in statistical theory separation of sampling, which comes first, and then analysis. And so what you do is you sample first and then you do the analysis. So you do not sample and then you analyze and go back to the sample, etc. That would spoil your sample. That would spoil the randomness of the sample. What is the difference between random sampling and theoretical sampling? Thomas, that goes directly to you. That comes from the chat.
Yeah, sure. So I can go back to the slide. I guess this makes it a bit easier. So in random sampling, you try to achieve a sample that is representative of a given population that you are analyzing. So let's say you want to, let's say you do a quantitative study on purchasing behavior for your amusement park. What you would, and you have, let's say, a customer database with 30,000 customers. What you would do then is you use some kind of random algorithm to choose different customers from this database. You probably would have to do some additional stuff, but let's keep it simple here. And then and the idea of this of choosing these customers randomly, let's say 3,000 customers of these 30,000 customers, is to make sure that you don't have an implicit bias here. So you just so you do not choose the different customers based on some questions that you already have in mind, but rather the idea is to make sure that the sample that you end up analyzing, because for whatever reason you are not analyzing all 30,000 at once, just 3,000 here, is representative of the overall population. Now, in theoretical sampling, your sample may not be representative of the given population at all, because maybe you have specific questions about, let's say, older customers. What you would then do is you look specifically at older customers. You sample older customers. You interview older customers. Okay, so this is, did this make this clear?
And when you sample older customers, you may run into, you have not thought about this, that there is 2 different types of marital status. So older customers can be widows, or they can still live in a relationship. Okay, you have not thought about this, but at a certain stage, it becomes obvious that there is something, marital status, that may affect this theoretical sampling is not random. It's not random. You think about who you select, and then you try to get information from this person. I think that is very, very important. You do not select randomly. Okay.
So maybe I make another example here that makes it a bit more clearer. Let's say you want to.
I think it's okay. We already received the thank you.
Okay. So then I will just continue, Bernd. Any questions here before we move on? Okay, this seems not to be the case. So let's get on with the next point on our agenda, which is the Joya template for doing grounded theory. So first things first, what is a template? A methodological template is essentially a standardized way of conducting your research, of doing your research. So a template provides essentially a formula for implementing a specific methodology, and it thus includes some specifications for the different parts of your methodology, whether it is data collection, sampling, as we just talked about, the way you analyze your data, and sometimes even how you write it up. And yeah, so two common examples here are the Eisenhardt template for comparative case studies. My guess is that Madeleine may talk a bit about that. I'm not sure. This is in another research talk. It's a very common template for qualitative research. And another one, which is also very, very predominant, is the Joya's template for grounded theory. And what that is, I will talk about that in the next slides. Before I do that, however, some things that novice researchers should keep in mind when thinking about templates, and especially when using templates. So templates have some advantages and some disadvantages. Advantages are that, well, first of all, best practices are codified in these templates. So even, I mean, especially if you are new, you don't know yet how to properly do maybe qualitative research, and then relying on such a template makes it easier for you to do stuff in a way that is already tried and tested by often senior researchers that recommend you to do things in a particular way, that recommend you to sample in a specific way, that recommend you to analyze your data in a specific way. And as a result of that, obviously, this is a good research starting point for new researchers, for young researchers. And it also helps you to simplify the evaluation of your research. So once you're done, let's say with your master thesis, you can once again look at the template, at the recommendations for the given template that you were using, and then go through your research and look at, did I actually do the stuff that is written down there? So it makes it easier for you to make sure that you had some level of rigor in your research. So these are the advantages on the left side. On the right side, there are also some disadvantages of templates. And one is certainly that they may give you a misleading impression of the simplicity of the research process. And I think this is particularly true for qualitative research, and maybe particularly true for the Joya template, that if you just read, let's say, the paper in which Joya, who is the author of this template, introduced the template, you're probably not well equipped to actually do the stuff, because there's a lot of things that are a lot of things that are happening in the background that he just doesn't talk about. So this is the first disadvantage. The second one is that templates may lead to a formulaic application of methodological moves. So oftentimes these templates are tailored to specific kinds of research problems. And if your research problem is not this kind of research problem, it may not be particularly helpful to apply this template to your research, because it's just not made for that. Next point kind of goes into the same line. And the last one is one that I also want to talk about, because it is particularly important for the Joya template. That is that templates may lead to a superficial understanding of the core of the methodology. So what Joya and his co-authors did is not that they developed an entirely new methodology, but they base their Joya method template on grounded theory. So to properly do the Joya template, I will repeat that later once again, is to properly apply it, you have to know what grounded theory is, and you should have read the basic literature of grounded theory, which I would consider to be 2 or 3 books. Yeah, so my recommendation here with templates in general is use a common template in your master thesis because it makes things a lot easier for you. But don't forget to also dive into the fundamental methodological literature. Ideally, just ask your supervisor, is there some stuff that you can recommend to me to read? Usually we have some experience here and can help you out. And then actually take the time to read this stuff. So sometimes it sounds a bit intimidating to tell students, well, read this book here and then you know. But some of the books are very well written. They are not terribly long. Some of them, I would argue, you can read in 2 to 3 days. And it will help you so much later down the line when you actually do the stuff. And because it just allows you to develop a proper understanding of what you're actually doing. So this much about templates in general. What is the Joya template though? So the Joya template describes a certain way to conduct grounded theory studies. And it goes back to the author, Dennis Joya. Dennis Joya is, I would say a very renowned researcher who has published a lot of papers in very highly ranked journals using this methodology. And since he was so good at that, he eventually was asked to codify his template of how he's doing this, of how he is conducting grounded theory in a methodological paper, which you see here. It's Joya et al. 2013. And yeah, this template has, especially since this publication, not been just applied by Joya and his co-authors, but also by many other authors, and also in many instances in very highly, in papers that are published in very highly ranked journals. So what is the general goal of the Joya template? The goal is to improve the scientific rigor of new concept development using grounded theory. And it does so by forcing, so the elements of the Joya template force you as a researcher to make use of a more disciplined approach of how you conduct grounded theory. And by using this more disciplined approach, for instance, by using illustrations such as data structures, etc., I will show them in a second, it makes the interpretations that you are doing of your data more credible because it shows to the readers how you came to know about researching. So the specific moves of the template show the reader how the author knows what she claims she knows. Okay, so this is the goal of the Joya template. Have that in mind with everything that I tell you in a second. Essentially, the Joya templates makes specifications about 4 major core areas. The first one is foundational assumptions of your research. The second one, the research question. Third, the analytic procedure. And then last but not least, a bit about the writing. And yeah, we'll go through them one by one. Let's start with the foundational assumptions. Joya's grounded theory is an interpretive approach with 4 core assumptions. So interpretive is one of those words that we will learn a bit more about in one of the later installments. For now, just try to understand that what it means is that part of reality is, this is the first point, is social constructed. So this is a basic assumption of the Joya template. What does that mean? Let's try to explain it with an example here. Let's say, for instance, let's think about what the word rich means. So the word rich can mean very different things depending on the social context you operate in. So let's say, for instance, you're still a student, you are still a student, so we don't have to say that, for instance, and you think about who is rich. My guess would be that, let's say someone that has been working for a couple of years at Daimler, has a very good job there. You may consider him to be rich just because he has a very good salary. Now we can ask the same question among, let's say, some people that are multimillionaires. So Who is rich among the multimillionaires? So a multimillionaire may say, well, for me, really, someone is only rich if he's a billionaire or something like that. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here with the example is part of what the word rich actually means, part of what it says about reality, is also dependent on the social context you operate in. So this is the first point. Second one is people construct their own organizational realities and are knowledgeable agents. Knowledgeable agents means that they can actually express their thoughts, intentions, and actions in words. And that means that, well, you can use interviews to find out about whatever you want to learn more about. Third one is that researchers take the role of a glorified reporter. So this goes back to what I was referring to as that the theoretical model should be grounded in data. The idea is that the researcher should not stray too far away from what your informants, the people that you interview, or the people that talk about something in the secondary data that you are using are actually talking about. So you should look at the words, you should look at what is actually said, and not just code something that, or include something in your theoretical model that you just came up with because you think it's right, because that would be armchair theorizing again. Instead, researchers should take the role of glorified reporters. And last but not least, researcher, which is kind of contradictory to the third one, is that researchers are knowledgeable too. So sometimes you may encounter some instances where an interviewee may not specifically say something, but you can really read it between the lines. And this is a case where you as a researcher can be the knowledgeable agent too and say, well, the informant is not really saying this, but what he is meaning is this. Okay, so this is also possible. It's kind of contradictory to the third one, but yeah, it's also part of the one of the four core assumptions of the Joya template. So on to the next one, the research question. Research questions in the Joya template are well specified, but remain broad and general. So I've already talked a bit about that when I was talking about grounded theory in general. Research questions in the Joya template usually focus on the process. They clearly specify who is doing something, but keep the what, and this is the important point, rather general. So an example that I brought with me, it's actually from one of the Joya papers, I think. How do top managers of academic institutions make sense of their environments? So if you think a bit about this research question, you may find that there are still many different, let's say, research avenues that you could go down to. So this research question is still rather broad, and it just gives you a broad direction you walk into, but it doesn't already say specifically what you will end up addressing with your theoretical model. And the idea of this is to make sure that your research question only serves as guidance for a general direction for data collection. So you do not want to constrict the scope of data collection to make sure that you don't miss out on some completely new stuff that you may have missed out if you confine the bounds of your research already too closely before you start data collection. So the idea here is that you collect data, you look at the data, and then you may find, well, this is actually interesting here. Maybe I should take a closer look at this. And at the end of the day, this may even change your research question completely sometimes. So this much about the research question in the Joya template. Next point, the analytic procedure. So the Joya template makes explicit recommendations on the analytic procedure and distinguishes essentially 4 steps here. The first one is first order coding, second order coding, then identifying theoretical dimensions, and last but not least, the theoretical modeling part. Before I speak more about each of these steps, you should keep in mind that these 4 steps actually overlap. So this is not a separate step. You first do first order coding, then second order coding, and so on and so on. But actually, you do them more or less simultaneously, especially once you have more than just one interview that you analyze. And another important point, and I would say this is pretty much like the core of the Joya methodology, of the Joya template, that you illustrate your analytic procedure using a data structure and then the result as a theoretical model. So before I explain what a data structure in the theoretical model is, let's take a closer look at the 4 steps once again here. So first you have first order coding. So my guess is that some of you can not yet really, don't really have an idea of what the word coding means in qualitative research. So the most basic thing that you do when you do qualitative research is coding. And coding means that you assign some words that capture the meaning of, let's say, a lot of sentences that you are analyzing. So let's say you have conducted an interview. You look at the transcript of your interview. You have, this interview has let's say 200 sentences. And then you look at the first paragraph and you want to assign meaning to this paragraph. And what you do is you usually use some kind of program. In this course, you will use MaxQDA to assign a code that stands for the meaning of this paragraph, let's say. So for instance, you have conducted an interview with a customer of your amusement park. And in one paragraph, he talks about weather. So what you do is, this is a very descriptive one, but it's a simple example. So in this paragraph, it talks about weather. And what you do is you assign the code weather to this paragraph, or hot weather to this paragraph. This is what coding is in qualitative research. So in the Joya methodology, we have different steps of coding. The first one is first order coding, where you apply simple codes using the terminology of the informants. So you try to stay, by choosing the codes that represent the meaning of a paragraph of a couple of sentences, you choose words that, that are very close to the words that the informants actually use. The result of that is usually that you assign a code to, let's say, every 2 or 3 sentences. So you have a large number of codes. The idea is that the researcher gets kind of lost in these codes. So I think what that means is you only really understand what it means once you do it. And because if you do it, you will realize that doing this first order coding, you will end up having, for an interview, many different codes. For instance, when I was doing my first one, when I was coding a podcast transcript, I had like, I don't know, 60, 65 codes for just this one podcast transcript. And then I had to go through them again. I was at the beginning kind of lost, but this is the very idea of the step actually, because you want to avoid to distill the info too much. And we will see why in a second. So this is first order coding. Second order coding is where the researcher, as a knowledgeable agent, starts to distill these first order codes down to a more manageable number of codes, let's say 20 or 30 from originally 60. And the idea is to use words for these codes that have some kind of theoretical meaning. So you have a couple of first order codes that are very close to what the informant has said, and then a second order code that summarizes these first order codes. Yeah, and these categories, they are usually also used to lead the further data collection. So you have some first theoretical category, and then you think, well, I have to find out more about that and sample some data that will help you to do so. So this is second order coding. The next step is essentially the same thing as second order coder, just that you go a step further and aggregate second order codes to dimensions, which you could also refer to as third order codes, I guess. And last but not least, the fourth step is where you actually derive a theoretical model. So you have a bunch of second order codes, a bunch of theoretical dimensions, and then during the theoretical modeling step, you think about how do these different codes, second order codes, how do these different theoretical dimensions relate to each other? And this is where you then start to illustrate the model that you are using. and at some point also embed the theoretical model that you come up with in the existing literature, especially in the discussion of your paper. So these are the 4 steps of the analytic procedure in the Joya template. And what you're seeing here is an example from a Joya paper where they did this. So this illustration that you see on the left here is what they refer to as the data structure. So on the left-hand side, you see here the first order concepts. So for instance, loss of parent company as direct comparison. And as you can see, these first order concepts are very close, first order codes are still very close to what the informants seem to have said. So for instance, here, we don't even know who we are right now. Understand the labels, but what do they mean? So stuff like that, it's very close to what an informant could have said. So these are the first order codes, left-hand side. Then you see second order codes. So here, for instance, identity ambiguity summarizes a total of 4 first order codes. We don't even know who we are right now, etc., etc. And then on the right-hand side, we have the aggregate dimensions that summarize multiple second order themes. Okay, so increasing summarization, so to speak. Now, why are we doing all this? Why do Joya recommend using such a data structure to visualize your analytic procedure? The idea is that this data structure makes it a lot easier for the reader to follow how you came up with, let's say, your aggregate dimensions or your second order themes. So they see on the left-hand side the first order codes. They can kind of imagine what the informant might have said, what the interviewee might have said. And then they can, based on that, see, well, this is why you came up with this theoretical second order themes and the aggregate dimensions. And since researchers in this template have to show this data structure, it also disciplines them to actually only come up with second order themes and aggregate dimensions that are in the data, that where they do have first order concepts for. Okay, so this is the idea of the data structure. And then here, very quickly, also an example of a theoretical model. So in grounded theory in general, I would say, but particularly in the Joya template, the idea is to eventually come up with such an illustration of boxes and arrows, etc., that depicts your theoretical model. This is what is meant with theory in the Joya template or in grounded theory. You want to have some model that, if you look at it, allows you to explain some kind of phenomena, the phenomenon that you are investigating, which is, once again, in the Joya template, usually a process, as you can see here. And yeah, so essentially what this illustration does, it organizes them into a process here, depicts the relationships through spatial ordering. So we have some on the right-hand side, some on the left-hand side, some boxes in between, but also through arrows. And the idea of this is to, once again, help the researcher to develop the theory by serving as an analysis tool, and thus give the reader an overview of the overarching theoretical model. So this is the illustration of the theoretical model. And these two things are like I would argue, it's more or less the core. Usually they also add what they refer to as a data table, where they have the first order codes on the right-hand side, and then some quotes that refer to these first order codes on the left-hand side, but that's not always the case. So that much about the analytic procedure, and then very briefly about the writing. So Joya and his co-authors, they also make some suggestions about how you should write up your research. And I do not want to go through all of this in detail, because first, you will have, as far as I know, one installment on this. And second, many of the things that I recommend are actually very similar to what you would do in more or less any paper. There's one thing, however, that I would like to stress here, and that is the literature review. So what Joya et al. Say is that in a Joya template paper, your literature review does not have to be as extensive or exhaustive as in some other papers. And this is kind of related to what I said earlier about grounded theory in general, where I said, well, you should stay open-minded, and maybe you don't have to know every single paper that is in some way, shape, or form related to what you are researching. However, and this is very important, that does not mean that you don't have to do a proper literature review. You still need a literature review. And what I would argue is the bigger difference between, let's say, a Joya paper or a grounded theory paper and some other papers is the bigger difference is in the timing where you actually do the literature review, not in the write-up, but the timing where you look at the literature. So what a lot of people suggest you should do in grounded theory is that you have different phases of, let's say, of literature review. So first, you just want to, as I've already talked about earlier, just read some papers to get a general idea of the field that you're researching in, especially if you want, especially since you want to avoid doing something that maybe has already been done before. And then the further down the line, the further you get with your research project, the more you already know, the further you get to your final theoretical model, the more you want to start reading about the field your theoretical model connects to, in order to be able to discuss it in terms of what we already know about the field. Okay, so this is something that I want to stress. Bernd, I think you wanted to say something because you.
No.
Okay, I had
everything. Okay.
Because the last time I remember you made a comment here. Okay, so the other points: introduction, methodology section, findings section, discussion section. I don't want to talk about that too much. Maybe just the methodology section. That and this is once again something that is very common for almost all qualitative papers. I would say in qualitative research, usually you have to describe a bit more about your methodology. You have to describe a bit more because researchers have more leeway to do stuff not properly. And by describing what you actually did, you can signal to the readers, well, I actually did it properly. And this is not that much the case in quantitative studies, I would say, because usually if you apply a method, well, there are some more or less accepted standards on how you should do things, and then you just have to apply to those, and you don't have to explain that too much. But in qualitative papers, you usually have to write a bit more about your methodology. Okay, so a couple of last things about first of all, a word of caution. So I've already briefly touched upon this. The Joya template is based on grounded theory, specifically the grounded theory approach of Corbin and Strauss, or previously Strauss-Corbin. And the result of that is that the paper where they specify this template, it does not really explicitly specify every detail of what they are doing. So, for instance, the way they code, the way they come up with the initial codes, they just make a brief reference to coding, and which is a way to code stuff that Corbin and Strauss use, but they do not really explain it. So if you don't know the grounded theory approach by Corbin and Strauss, you cannot properly do Joya because they just base everything that they are doing on these previous authors. And yeah, another thing is that the Joya template is still an integrated grounded theory approach. So the idea is not to, for instance, just use a data structure. This is also what a lot of researchers are doing, and sometimes get criticized for by reviewers. They just use the data structure and say, well, you see, I'm doing Joya. But actually, Joya is still an integrated grounded theory approach where you should incorporate these other components as well, meaning theoretical sampling, theoretical saturation, open-mindedness, etc. And yeah, so the consequence of all this is that a proper application of Joya requires knowledge of the fundamental grounded theory literature, and particularly and particularly grounded theory by Corbin and Strauss. So what you should avoid doing is to just use the Joyer's coding structure. So these first order concepts, second order themes, aggregate dimensions, and then call it Joyer. What you can do sometimes, I've had already master theses where students did this, or should have done this, where they just used Joyer coding, so the data structure, and then said, well, I'm using Joyer coding, but I'm not using grounded theory in general because I don't have these other components, and that can make sense in some cases as well. So yeah, next slide shows a couple of examples of Joyer papers. All of these are published in very highly ranked journals, Strategic Management Journal, as you can see here, Administrative Science Quarterly, etc., etc. So what you should take away here is you can publish in very highly ranked journals with this methodology. And also, I can always recommend to, if you use a certain template, if you use a certain methodology, look at some examples of very good papers that have used this methodology. It really helps you, on the one hand, to properly apply the methodology yourself. And on the other hand, and maybe this should be the first step, to get a better understanding of the type of things that you can do with this kind of methodology. So this is always very useful, and you can go back to this list if you want to. Okay, so last point on our agenda before we get to some questions is how can you apply all this in your thesis? So grounded theory allows you to, and this is, I think, very exciting about this method, this methodology, explore completely new topics for which there may not be that much scientific literature yet. So this is something that I did in my, certainly did in my bachelor thesis. It's also something that I did in a way in my master thesis. I had, which made it kind of difficult for me. I always looked at topics that were rather new. So for instance, bachelor thesis was sharing economy. Back then, there wasn't a lot of literature about the sharing economy yet. And I mean, I was not doing grounded theory back then, but this would have been a great methodology to look at new stuff about, to find out new stuff about the sharing economy or how customers act in the sharing economy, etc. Second point, grounded theory makes use of an increasing amount of high quality verbal secondary data on the internet. This is something that I'm doing as well. So you can, grounded theory allows you, and I would say qualitative research in general allows you to get very creative about the kinds of data that you are using. This can be, as I said, YouTube comments, it can be podcast transcripts, it can be transcripts of some other videos on YouTube, etc., etc. I think we once had an example task, Bernd, in this course where students had to analyze song texts, so lyrics of rap songs. So there's a lot of creative stuff that you can do, and I think I would say grounded theory is also particularly suited to that. Then the next point is that you can do a deep dive into some topic you are personally interested in. And this is like the really intriguing thing about this. You can do all this while still doing something that is practically relevant and anchored in the real world. So you remember the term theory in grounded theory is used in a specific way. And the idea of theory in grounded theory is that you come up with something that actually explains and predicts something, and that can also ideally be used by practitioners in the real world. And so I would argue that for those of you that maybe do not necessarily want to make a career in academia, this could also be a very beneficial method to come up with something in your thesis that is very relevant for practitioners as well. And yeah. So how can you prepare for your master thesis if you want to use grounded theory? Some general notes first. I recommend using basing everything on the grounded theory approach by Corbin Strauss, and then use the Joyer template, as this data structure makes things a lot easier, especially if you do it the first time. Then focus on substantive theory. I think this is actually a slide that I jumped over, so maybe I quickly explain it here. In grounded theory, you distinguish two types of theory, where you have formal theory on the one hand and substantive theory on the other hand. Formal theory means that you have something that you come up with a theoretical model that is applicable to a lot of empirical contexts. So let's say you come up with something you come up with some theory that you can apply to all kinds of different companies, whether it is an amusement park company, whether it is an automobile company, etc., etc. You have a general theory about purchasing behavior. This would be formal theory. Substantive theory, on the other hand, is only applicable to a limited empirical context. So let's say, for instance, you have a theoretical model that is only applicable to amusement park companies, but not to other kind of companies. This would be more substantive theory. And as you can already tell here, there is no either formal or either substantive theory, but rather it is a continuum. So your theoretical model can be more substantive or more formal. And what I would suggest to you in your thesis is always to aim at substantive theory, as it's just easier to just look at something for a limited empirical context, and to not aim at some great grand new formal theories, such as a new kind of, let's say, transaction cost economics or whatever. Then the next tip here is to discuss with your supervisor how to handle some of the limitations that you always have, since you just write a thesis and don't have multiple years of time to write an entire paper. So discuss when you can actually stop with the data collection, because chances are that you may not be able to reach theoretical saturation. And yeah, this I've already talked about it. You should not aim at formal theory. And then on the right-hand side, I've also prepared a quick preparation guideline. So if you really want to do it the proper way, I would suggest you to first take a look at this book here from the 60s. I know it's already quite old, but what I can tell you is it's a very easy read. You can read it in, let's say, 2 days. It's written very well, and it's not terribly long. And it really gives you a good first impression of what grounded theory is. Then I would move on to read at least some sections from this book here. It would be even better to use one of the older versions, which are still called Corbin-Strauss from 1990, actually. But those are very hard to get your hands on. There are more or less no electronic versions of them, and the only one I found is an EPUB format, which is not very easy to read. So you can just use this one, which is fine as well. I've used it myself. And then read the paper by Joy et al., where they specify the template. Read one or multiple example papers of Joya. Get acquainted with MaxQDA. This is the program that you will get to know a bit later in our installments that you can use to code your data. And then actually practice coding with some transcripts before you do your proper coding for your research project. Okay, so one more thing. How can you come up with interesting research topics? I would argue that there are two major ways to come up with research topics that you can investigate with grounded theory. So the first one on the left-hand side is question first. So you come up with some question that you're interested in. This is the first step. And then you think about what data sources could I use to actually answer this question. And once again, you can be very creative here. Everything is data, is the mantra. And then try to, well, explore your research question based on the data that you find, if you find enough data that you can actually use. And one thing here is what you can almost always do is to just conduct interviews to generate new data. Quick heads up here, though, is in a master thesis, it's not always easy to get enough interview partners. So we have a lot of master thesis candidates that do conduct interviews, but if they do that, oftentimes they had already some connections to people because they did an internship somewhere or were in some other way, shape or form involved in an ecosystem and know a lot of people that way, and can that way easily acquire some interview candidates. What I've also seen is that some candidates just get very creative in generating interview partners. For instance, they write public LinkedIn comments under posts by some people in order to create some public pressure to actually help them out, etc. But this is something that you can almost always do. Interviews are always an option, so keep that in mind. So the first option of how coming up a research question is question first. And the second one on the right-hand side is to start with the data. This is actually something that I did. So sometimes you may also come across some data sources that you just find interesting, and then think about what kind of questions could I address with these data sources that I know. I will just move on to the next slide, I think, to show you what I mean by that. So what I did, once again, is I used the second option, data first. And I started with a general interest in startups and how to found a company. And then I figured, well, actually, there seems to be more or less an explosion of freely available high quality material on how you should start a startup. So those of you that maybe have already some connection to that will know that there are tons of accelerators that have startup programs that are completely public. They publish everything, all videos, all blog posts, etc. There are certainly a lot of books by Reid Hoffman, Eric Ries, etc. All these famous entrepreneurs or entrepreneurship scholars from around the world, where they write stuff about how to start a company. And then I was wondering, well, maybe some of this stuff can be used as secondary data in a research project. And I wanted to read all that anyways, because I was interested in that. And that way I could kind of combine what I want to read, like just privately anyways, because I find it interesting, with my research projects. So what I then did was this is my first paper, came up with this idea that I could address the research question from the perspective of entrepreneurial wisdom in Silicon Valley. How do startups know their product is ready to scale? And what I'm now doing is I'm analyzing, I came up with a very elaborate way of doing that, I would say. And I'm analyzing transcripts of podcasts, videos, blog posts, etc., in order to answer my research question. So this is an example of data first. Okay. That much from my side. I think I went through it pretty quickly. I was talking pretty fast, I would say, but actually we're already almost done with the lecture. So yeah, I hope you could follow. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot.
We stay as long as there's questions, of course.
Maybe
my next course only starts at 4:15, so we have plenty of time. So is there questions? Maybe one comment to clarify the structure that we have here. On December 12th, we will have another research talk, and there we will talk with Johannes Dahlke from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. And he will present a paper where he used grounded theory and the Joya template, more or less. So you will get to see a paper, or get to see that what Thomas profoundly introduced applied. So you will see this, and of course it would be good that if you just before December 12th look again at the slides here and recap what Thomas was saying, so that will certainly help you in understanding Johannes' research. Okay, in between, in 2 weeks, I guess, we have November 28th, we have Madeleine Möller coming up with case study research. Any questions, any comments? from your side? Not that I see. Do you see any, Thomas?
Nope.
Okay, wonderful. So what we do now is we close the session. We, yes, of course, I will upload the stuff, the video, the recording up to Elias, of course. All right, so thanks everybody. Thank you, Thomas, for this profound introduction into grounded theory. And everybody have a great rest of the week. And remember, tomorrow is bank holiday in Germany, in southern Germany, no, in Germany, whole of Germany. If you need to buy groceries, and you need to do it today. All right. See you on November 28th at the latest. Bye-bye.
Bye.